unconstitutional. So how are activists today fighting for voting rights? LaTosha Brown is the co-founder of the voting rights group Black Votes Matter, based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and she joins us now. LaTosha Brown, welcome to On Point. It's great to have you.
Greetings. Thank you for having me on.
Well, tell me about the goals of your organization, Black Voters Matter, and your goals right now. What are you focused on?
You know, the goals of our organization is to help build power for our community by creating an engaged electorate to actually help shape the public policy that's impacting our communities. And so ultimately we do that in a variety of ways, from voter registration, but voter education and mobilization. And so some of the goals now, we've been in existence for the last 5 years, and part of what we believe that strengthens democracy in a nation that touts itself as a model democracy when a third of the people are not even interested in the process, and at least in any given election year, 40% of the population don't even bother to vote. And we're saying that in order to have a strong democracy, you're going to have an engaged and informed electorate. And so that's part of the work that we lead at Black Voters Matter Fund. You know, what we're working on right now is essentially really pushing against the voter suppression that we've seen. You know, we're going to have to really think about what is happening right now. We're going to have to call it what it is. We can't create these binaries or these false equivalencies that, okay, the Democrats did this and so the Republicans' response to that. No, it's much deeper than that. This is really, as I see it, political corruption at its core. Anytime people are participating in the process and there are punitive measures because they've participated, the very definition of that is political corruption. And so what we're seeing the rise of voting restriction laws that restrict access to the ballot in 48 states around the country, right? Being in my native state of Georgia, that were literally targeted to punish, to be a punitive measure, to punish and to be more, and to marginalize the vote in those areas because people participated in a way that some folks were not happy with the outcome.
So I want to ask you, you mentioned Georgia, and I wanted to ask you about Georgia, and we talked about that earlier in the hour. You worked alongside Stacey Abrams. You helped turn Georgia blue for the first time in 28 years. There was, in the 2020 election, more than 1 million African Americans cast ballots in Georgia. But as you mentioned, it's one of the states where new legislation has been passed. Folks like you think it make a case that it restricts access to the ballot. So let's start there. Is the law in Georgia, do you see it as risking turning the progress that you've made there back?
You know, it's kind of like the death by 1,000 cuts. I think we have to really look at the spectrum of voter suppression. You know, people will look at, there's voting laws or voting ID laws. Oh, that's not that bad. That's just, okay, that has some impact, but that's a little impact. Then people will look at, the polling site, the massive closure of polling sites that happened after the 2013 Shelby versus Holder election. In addition to that, what you're also seeing is a massive kind of coordinated concerted effort to purge voters from the rolls. Just a few weeks ago, the Republican Secretary of State dropped over 100,000 voters from the rolls. In addition to that, now you have these restrictions that are not just only restricting access to the ballot on when you can vote, early voting, what places you have access to. But I think the most egregious part, and Senator Kaine alluded to this in his conversation, that they're weaponizing the administrative process. What we're seeing is the Secretary of State in Georgia right now is calling for the resignation of the head of the election boards in the local counties. And there's an attempt to take over those election boards. So now this administration process, which I think is the most egregious, that if the ruling party does not like the outcome, that they will have some authority, even more so than the Secretary of State, to make a different outcome, which was precisely what President Trump was asking for in this last election when he wanted the Secretary of State to just go, quote, find 11,000 votes. We have to really be able to see what is at stake. While this has been an effort that we know, I think the impetus has been to punish Black voters and other voters, Democratic-leaning voters in this process. And in some very weird ways, we're going to have to be honest about the role of structural racism, because America seems to have a strong tolerance. We have a lot of tolerance when Black voters are impacted in this country. And so we have to really see it that while, yes, that's one of the outcomes, that it fundamentally undermines and unravels the foundation of democracy whenever a ruling party is able to change the rules because they don't like the outcome. That in itself is the beginning of the death of democracy.
This is On Point. I'm Anthony Brooks. Meanwhile, LaTosha Brown, we seem to be at an impasse in approving major federal voting rights laws in Washington. How frustrated are you about that? And do you see a path forward in Washington?
I'm extremely frustrated. The fact that we're in 2021, and we are in the year that there was a historic turnout of voters, and now we have to go right back to defend making sure that we're giving access. A strong democracy is not a structure or a system that is restrictive to voters or is punitive to voters. In fact, we should be having conversations how we can expand accessibility. Even in the state of Georgia, in the last election, in the primary of last year in 2020, there were people that stood in line for more than 11 hours. I and my team actually was at one polling site where the last voter did not vote until 12:37 a.m., which is essentially the next day. I'm raising this because I think we have to really understand there is a fundamental issue in this country around the political and the voting infrastructure. We cannot negotiate the rights of citizens or our democracy literally will be unraveled. We need voting rights legislation right now. And so what we know is with the filibuster has been used historically over the years to actually stand in a way and be a tool against civil rights legislation. We need we need President Biden. We need him to use the full weight of his office to put pressure on the Senate that whether that's a carve out, whether that's the abolition of the filibuster, we cannot in any circumstances allow voters to be punished because how they voted or who they voted for.
Well, LaTosha Brown, co-founder Black Voters Matter, I want to really thank you for joining us today and giving us your perspective. I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you for having me.